On that humid spring morning of 1846, when the dogwoods bloomed white along the red clay roads of Magnolia Grove Plantation, and the smell of fresh-cut pine filled the air from the carpentry workshop, Margaret Pendleton stood on the veranda of her columned mansion, watching the men work below, and in her heart burned a desire so consuming that it would destroy her marriage, ruin a dozen lives, and create a scandal that the good people of Montgomery County would spend decades trying to forget. For Margaret had decided that she would have them all. Every single man who worked in that workshop, not out of love or even lust, but out of a need to prove that she could. That her beauty and her power gave her dominion over any man regardless of his station or his race. And if this story grips your heart, leave your like and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter, because what comes next reveals the darkest corners of the human soul when privilege meets depravity and power corrupts absolutely. Margaret Pendleton was 24 years old, born into one of Alabama's finest families, educated at a finishing school in Charleston, where she learned French, piano, and the art of managing a household with slaves. She had married Colonel James Pendleton at 19. A man 16 years her senior who owned Magnolia Grove's 1,500 acres and 200 enslaved souls. The marriage had been arranged by their families to unite two great fortunes. But James was a cold man, more interested in his cotton profits and his political ambitions than in his beautiful young wife. He spent most nights in his study reviewing ledgers or in Montgomery attending legislative sessions, leaving Margaret alone in that great house, with nothing but her embroidery and her increasingly dark thoughts. The workshop was James's pride. He had built it 3 years earlier to be self-sufficient in all carpentry needs, producing everything from furniture for the big house to coffins for the slaves who died in the fields. 7 men worked there under the supervision of Luther, a skilled craftsman of 50 years who had been trained by a German master carpenter before being sold south. And it was to this workshop that Margaret began making daily visits in the spring of 1846, at first with legitimate excuses, bringing water to the workers on hot days, commissioning a new wardrobe for her bedroom, asking Luther's advice on repairs needed in various parts of the house. Luther was the first, not because she desired him most, but because he was the leader, and Margaret understood that if she could break him, the others would follow. She began staying longer during her visits, asking him to explain the intricacies of joinery and wood selection, standing close enough that he could smell her perfume, touching his arm lightly when he showed her his work. Luther was a married man. His wife Delilah worked in the kitchen, and they had been together 30 years. He tried to maintain proper distance from the mistress, but Margaret was patient and persistent. The moment came on an afternoon when James was away in Montgomery for a week-long legislative session. Margaret sent word that she needed Luther to come to the big house to measure for new bookshelves in the library. When he arrived, tools in hand, she was waiting in a dress of pale blue silk that clung to her figure. The library door was already locked from the inside. "Luther," she said, her voice honey over steel, "I've been watching you work. Such strong hands, such skill. I wonder what else those hands might be capable of." Luther backed toward the door. "Mistress, this ain't proper. I should go fetch one of the other men to help with these measurements." But Margaret moved closer, blocking his retreat. "You're not going anywhere, Luther. Not until you give me what I want. And if you refuse, I'll tell Colonel Pendleton that you forced yourself on me, touched me inappropriately. And you know what happens to slaves who assault white women. They burn them alive in the town square." The trap was perfect. Luther understood that he had no choice, that his life, his wife's life, his very existence hung on this moment. And so he surrendered, hating himself with every breath, feeling his soul crack and splinter like the wood he worked so carefully in the shop. That afternoon marked the beginning of Margaret's systematic campaign. She moved through the workshop men like a general conquering territory, each conquest planned and executed with cold precision. After Luther came Tobias, a man of 35 with a voice like thunder who sang spirituals while he worked. Margaret seduced him by praising his singing, asking him to teach her the melodies, then moving from music to more intimate lessons. Next was Nathaniel, 28 years old, who had a talent for carving intricate designs. Margaret commissioned increasingly elaborate pieces just to keep him working alone in a side room where she could visit him without others seeing. Then came Moses, the youngest at 22, barely more than a boy, who had apprenticed under Luther since age 14, and still had an innocence in his eyes that Margaret took particular pleasure in destroying. Those who heard this story could not remain indifferent, just as you shouldn't. If this story touched you, leave your like so it won't be forgotten. Because what happened as Margaret's obsession deepened reveals how one person's cruelty can poison an entire community. Within 6 months, Margaret had been intimate with all 7 workshop men, but she wasn't satisfied with simple conquest. She began orchestrating situations where they would know about each other, leaving small signs that made it clear she was seeing others, creating jealousy and competition among men who had previously been brothers in bondage. Luther would find a handkerchief belonging to Margaret hidden in Tobias's tool chest. Nathaniel would discover her comb in Moses's pocket. These small cruelties served no purpose except to increase their suffering, to remind them that they were not men to her, but toys to be played with and discarded. The workshop became a place of tension and misery. The men stopped singing while they worked, stopped the friendly banter that had once made the long days bearable. Each man was trapped in his own private hell, unable to confide in the others, because to speak of what Margaret was doing would be to admit their own shame, their own powerlessness, their own violation. Luther aged 10 years in those 6 months. His hair went from salt and pepper to pure white. His hands that had once created such beautiful furniture began to shake. His wife Delilah knew something was wrong, but when she asked, he would only say he was tired. How could he tell her the truth? How could he explain that their mistress was using him like an animal, that he had to submit or watch Delilah be sold away or worse? The younger men coped in different ways. Moses began drinking, stealing whiskey from the big house, and getting drunk alone in the woods. Tobias stopped singing entirely, his magnificent voice silenced by shame. Nathaniel's intricate carvings became violent and disturbing, full of tortured figures and scenes of suffering that he would destroy before anyone else could see them. But Margaret's game couldn't last forever. The breaking point came when Susanna, Luther's daughter who worked as a lady's maid in the big house, discovered her mother Delilah weeping in the kitchen late one night, and after much coaxing, Delilah confessed her suspicions about Luther, and the mistress, Susanna, who loved her father deeply and had her own reasons to resent Margaret's casual cruelty, decided to investigate. She began watching, noting the patterns of her mistress's visits to the workshop, the way the men would emerge looking haunted and broken. And one day she followed Margaret to a storage room behind the workshop where she was meeting with Tobias, and through a crack in the door, Susanna witnessed enough to confirm her worst fears. But Susanna was smart. She knew that if she went directly to Colonel Pendleton with accusations against his wife, she might not be believed, might herself be punished for insolence. So she took her evidence to someone she trusted, Reverend Isaiah Clark, a white minister who was known for his relatively progressive views on slavery and his willingness to hold white sinners accountable. Reverend Clark was horrified by what Susanna told him, but he too knew the dangers of making such accusations, so he approached the situation carefully. He went to Colonel Pendleton privately, as one gentleman to another, and suggested in the most delicate terms possible that perhaps the colonel might want to pay closer attention to his wife's activities, that there were rumors circulating that could damage the family's reputation if not addressed. Colonel Pendleton's first reaction was rage, not at his wife but at the Reverend for daring to impugn a lady's honor. But Reverend Clark persisted, suggested that perhaps the colonel might simply observe for himself, watch his wife's movements without announcing his presence, and reluctantly, skeptically, Pendleton agreed. What he witnessed over the next week shattered his world. He saw Margaret entering the workshop at odd hours, saw her disappearing into back rooms with various men, saw the fear and shame in those men's eyes when they emerged, and on the 8th day of his surveillance, He walked into that back storage room without knocking and found his wife in Nathaniel's arms. The fury that erupted was like a volcano that destroys everything within miles, like an earthquake that splits the earth, like a tidal wave that drowns entire coastlines. Colonel Pendleton dragged Margaret from the workshop by her hair, screaming obscenities that made the field hands stop their work and stare in shock. He had all 7 workshop men arrested and chained, and he called every white man on the plantation to witness what he declared would be justice served. Margaret begged, pleaded, tried to claim she had been forced, that the men had threatened her, but too many people had seen too much. Her lies unraveled before she could even finish speaking, and Pendleton, face purple with rage and humiliation, announced that the men would be sold immediately to the worst plantations he could find, death sentences disguised as business transactions. Luther was sold to a turpentine camp in the pine forests of Georgia where the fumes destroyed men's lungs within 2 years. Tobias went to the sugar fields of Louisiana where life expectancy was even shorter. Nathaniel was sent to a rice plantation in South Carolina where malaria killed most workers within a season. Moses and the other younger men were scattered to brutal cotton plantations across the deep South, separated forever from their families, their friends, their lives. As for Margaret, the laws of Alabama in 1846 gave Colonel Pendleton complete authority over his wife. She was property in the eyes of the law, just as the slaves were. He could not kill her without legal consequences, but he could make her life a living death. He locked her in a 3rd-floor room of Magnolia Grove, a room with barred windows and a door that could only be opened from the outside. She lived there for the next 7 years. Her meals brought by slaves who had been instructed not to speak to her. Her only view the workshop where her victims had labored. Watching new men work there, men who had heard whispers of what happened, but didn't know the full story. In 1853, Colonel Pendleton arranged for Margaret to be transferred to a private asylum in Virginia, a place where wealthy families sent their mad relatives to be forgotten. She lived there until 1871, outliving her husband by 3 years, and according to the institution's records, she spent her final decades in a state of near catatonia, speaking only to recite the names of the 7 men whose lives she had destroyed: Luther, Tobias, Nathaniel, Moses, Samuel, Jacob, and Ezekiel, over and over, like a prayer or a curse. The story of what happened at Magnolia Grove spread through Montgomery County, despite the Pendleton family's best efforts to suppress it. It became a cautionary tale whispered among the white elite about the dangers of leaving wives unsupervised, about the need for constant vigilance over slaves who might take advantage of white women's weakness. The narrative twisted and inverted until somehow Margaret became the victim, and the men she had systematically abused became the aggressors, which is perhaps the cruelest injustice of all. But among the slave communities of Alabama, the true story survived, passed down through generations, a reminder of the many forms that oppression and abuse could take, a testament to the fact that being enslaved meant having no protection even from those who claimed to be civilized, educated, Christian people. It was a story that said no one is safe when some humans are allowed to own others. When power is concentrated in the hands of those who see their fellow beings as property. Of the 7 men, only one survived long enough to see freedom. Moses made it through the hell of the cotton plantations, endured the Civil War, and lived to be 68 years old in 1895. 50 years after the events at Magnolia Grove, a journalist from the North interviewed Moses as part of a project documenting former slaves' experiences, and Moses told the full story of Margaret Pendleton for the first time, his words preserved in an archive that almost no one read for another 100 years. "She broke us," Moses said in that interview, his voice tired but clear. "Not just our bodies but our spirits. Made us hate ourselves. Made us feel like we were less than human, less than animals. And the worst part was knowing that even if we could have fought back, even if we could have refused, it would only have brought suffering to more people we loved. We were trapped in every direction. No escape, no justice, no dignity, just survival minute by minute, day by day. until finally Lincoln's proclamation came. And even then, freedom didn't feel free because we carried those scars forever. And if this story made your heart beat faster, go now to the channel and subscribe to discover the other voices that time tried to silence, because we must remember these stories, not to dwell in hatred, but to understand how systems of oppression function, how power corrupts, how the dehumanization of any group ultimately corrupts the humanity of everyone, slave and master alike. And we must remember, so that we never allow such systems to flourish again, in any form, under any justification. Because the lesson written in blood across American history is simple and terrible. When some humans are allowed to own others, when power is concentrated without accountability, when the law itself declares certain people to be property, then evil flourishes in ways that shock the conscience, but that are entirely predictable, given the structure of the system itself.